So good morning, all. It's nice to be, it's really nice to be back in this congregation again. I know many of you here. I've known many of you for years. And for those who don't know, I joined All Saints when I moved to Princeton in 1983 and was church shopping for a church with a good choir, and ended up here. And this is where I raised my three children. The oldest two, Gwyneth, lives in Philadelphia. She's almost 40, believe it or not, folks. You remember when she was a baby, maybe. Nevin is 38 and lives nearby and has two children. And my youngest was Sonja. That's Sonja. That's Sonja in 2016, having just come home from a week in the hospital. If I get a little verklempt, don't worry about it. That's okay. So when Sonja was first diagnosed with the rare genetic disorder that she had, I remember having dinner with a colleague, a business colleague. He happened to be a Christian Scientist. And I was lamenting all the trouble that truly, I was lamenting all the trouble we were going through. And he said to me something right out of Mrs. Eddy's writings. So she was a perfect child of God. Now, I'm not a Christian Scientist and I don't know a great deal about Christian Science, but I do believe that she was indeed a perfect child of God. She had a rare genetic disorder that was autosomal recessive. If you ever studied 10th grade biology and you used fruit flies to see which ones had wrinkly wings and which ones had red eyes, you remember how Mendelian genetics works. And her father and I were both carriers of a peculiar genetic difference on the PLA2G6 gene. And because of her disability, which was progressive, when she was born, she was just like an ordinary baby. As she grew up, when she was little, she seemed to have a bit of a learning disability, a learning disorder, and she was very clumsy. By the time she was 10, she was falling down all the time. And then the disease progressed very rapidly after that. And because of Sonja, I became engaged with the disability community. She couldn't go to the regular public middle school. And by the time she was, 11, 12 years old, the local school system just wasn't set up for her. She was using a walker at that point. And so she started attending the Midland School, which is up near North Branch, which is a school for children with developmental disabilities. All kinds of disabilities. So they were able to accommodate her physically, but also to accommodate her learning needs. Sonja had ordinary intelligence, but she had a significant communication and learning disability, which just got worse over time. I mean, Mary, you're here. You remember Sonja because you were her Sunday school teacher, and she loved Mrs. Bostock. And Priscilla was her age, roughly. And so Sonja was really part of the All Saints community. She was almost sort of a church mouse. She was with me all the time. But it's because of her that I became engaged with issues around disability. It did inspire, in some respects, my desire to go to seminary for starters, and then to seek ordination. And it also influenced my law practice because I began to represent families with disabled children, both young children and adult children. And it opened up a real world to me that many of us don't see. I had to think about terminology to describe the people I was encountering, the children at Sonja's school, the folks in group homes where I did my clinical pastoral education. I did my CPE through the ARC of Middlesex County. The ARC is a service agency that exists in the different counties in New Jersey to provide all kinds of services to adults with developmental disabilities, including group homes. And so there were 10 or so group homes that I went to visit on a regular basis with people with just this whole spectrum of disability. And of course, my clients. And then we're all taught to use person-centered descriptions. So instead of saying a disabled person, we were supposed to say a person with a disability. And then there are people who like to say differently abled. And then there are people who like to write dis/able. And I know that we all mean well when we do that, but the disabled actually just call themselves disabled. I had a woman say to me, I wouldn't call myself a person with Catholic faith. I would just call myself a Catholic. So I don't call myself a person with a disability. I'm disabled. And, all of us, if we live long enough, to some degree, will become disabled. But Sonja's needs were great. And by the time she was, she's 20 in this picture, she always looked incredibly youthful. That was part of the phenotype. The phenotype is the physical appearance of your disability. And in her particular disability, the children are beautiful. They have large eyes, long eyelashes, thick hair, small chins. They are just beautiful children. And they look younger than their age. And so Sonja's 20, but to me, she always looked like she was about 12, At this point, she's a paraplegic. Actually, she's a quadriplegic. She can't even really use her arms anymore. So every night, every few hours, I would get up, I would change her diaper, I would turn her, reposition her, and then, we'd get up early so we could get, cleaned up in bed and dressed and into her wheelchair, which is a feat in itself because she was about 120 pounds, and get her onto the special van that took her off to her school, or after she finished her schooling, to her day program. She graduated from her school at the age of 21, which you're allowed to do in New Jersey. But here, this is before the beginning of her final school year. This is part of the psalm that was read at her funeral, which was here at All Saints, and Sonja is buried in the churchyard. This psalm has always spoken to me. It talks to me about the intimacy between God and ourselves, that God knows us better than we know ourselves, and that we truly are made in God's image. And that's the thing that I began to think about when Sonja was diagnosed around the age of 11 or so. I began to wonder if I was somehow to blame for Sonja's disability, because although we had a diagnosis, we didn't yet know who was the carrier. We didn't have the specific genetic kind of, we didn't know how this happened. We didn't know how this happened. We knew it was incurable. We knew it was progressive. And I think that almost all parents of disabled children wonder, what did I do wrong? Did I do something when I was pregnant? Did I expose my child to something? And we're always thinking, is there a cure? Is there any point in even praying for a cure? I mean, I prayed mightily for years, believe me, that there'd be some sort of miracle that would remake her DNA and undo all the damage to her nervous system, to the iron that was accumulating in the tissues of her brain, to the inability to make the enzymes required to break down lipids, and that was like the root cause of her disability. But anyway, I just don't think that no matter how much we pray to God, that God remakes our DNA. because our DNA is essentially who we are. And indeed, why would God do that? But anyway, because I'm the kind of person who reads books, I began reading books. Here are a couple that were influential. So I had questions. I had questions about coping with a dying child. I read Isabel Allende's book, Paula, about her daughter who lapsed into a coma and never recovered. And I wanted to know how she came to terms with grieving for her daughter. And it was very hard. Then I read Henry Nouwen's book, Adam, God's Beloved. And I know some of you here are familiar with Henry Nouwen's work, especially The Wounded Healer and The Return of the Prodigal Son. Nouwen had been suffering, as I understand, from depression and overwork, and he was invited to become a chaplain at the L'Arche Daybreak community near Toronto. L'Arche, which is rainbow in French, was a movement started by Jean Vanier, a French priest who took in some adult disabled men and cared for them. And he discovered that, in many respects, the people that he thought he was caring for were actually caring for him. So these L'Arche communities exist around the world. And Nouwen went to one of these as a chaplain, but he became the caregiver for Adam, who was a nonverbal, disabled man, adult, living there. And I think he found that Adam, in many ways, cared for him. And in his book, he draws parallels between Adam's suffering and Christ's suffering. My critique of this is, as wonderful as the book is and the work that L'Arche does, Nouwen looked at it in a way that I think makes disability sacred. And disability is not sacred. It's not sacred. It's just a fact. It's just who we are. And then, you can't discuss the theology of disability without talking about Nancy Iceland, who was the leading proponent of this field of burgeoning field of the theology of disability. She had some genetic disorder, a bone disorder, disease of some sort, that required her to have 11 surgeries before she was a teenager. She was plagued by pain all her life, and she used a wheelchair to get around. But in spite of all that, she became a professor of sociology and religion at the Candler School of Theology in Atlanta. And she went on to write this work, which has influenced everybody who's involved in disability studies. She describes God. She imagines God in what she called a sip-puff wheelchair, the kind of wheelchair that a quadriplegic might use to move around by sipping and puffing through a straw that somehow makes the wheelchair work. She thought of God in that way, the kind used by many quadriplegics that enables them to maneuver the chair by blowing and sucking on a straw, not an omnipotent, self-sufficient God, but neither a pitiable, suffering servant. This was an image of God as a survivor, but also as a being that our society would label as possessing a questionable quality of life. And she reminds us that in the resurrection story, Jesus appears to his followers wounded. He appears with his wounds. And in her mind, she understood God to be disabled. And indeed, fulfilling God's promise to be Emmanuel, to be God with us, embodied both disabled and divine. So, So just what is the image and the likeness of God? I used to wonder, what the heck is that? And we've got to work through the fact that we have a translation from Hebrew into English. First of all, we should let you know that I like to use images as sort of starting points, as ways of working myself through thoughts. I find that it, like using an icon for prayer, that using images, art especially, just, helps me generate ideas or focus on something. And this is sort of a pen and ink drawing by Salvador Dali. We have God's big foot, God snapping his fingers, and then an angel and a human being, it appears. You made us but little lower than the angels, right? So anyway, it's an unusual way of thinking of God as creating human beings. In Hebrew, the word for image is tselem, and it has various meanings. It can mean a phantom or a shadow or an imitation, a resemblance to something. It can even mean an idol. And the likeness, the word likeness in Hebrew, which is demuth, means appearance. Sometimes it means a physical appearance or a resemblance, but especially a resemblance in relation to some quality. And in the text, the next thing is that human beings will have authority. So the resemblance, the likeness, is authority and not necessarily physical resemblance. Now, for Christians, Christ is the image of God. And we read that in John. No one has ever seen God. It is only God the Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known. Paul refers to Christ as the image of the invisible God. And in the letter to the Hebrews, he is the reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's very being. But does this mean just the physical appearance? No. I think it says something about the nature of God revealed to humanity in Christ and by Christ. We can think of certain attributes of God. Paul describes some of these as the fruits of the Holy Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness. We can also think of the gifts of the Spirit, which include wisdom, counsel, patience, fortitude. We can think of mercy, righteousness, truth, justice, perhaps above all, love. And there is also a relational aspect for Christians in the Trinity, our interdependence, our dependence on each other from infancy through old age into death. And our capacity for love resembles in some respect the relationship between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, who are our creator, our redeemer, and our sustainer. They are related to one another, and they are related to us as well. Some of you will recognize this painting called Christina's World. It's a famous painting by Andrew Wyeth. Christina Olson was a neighbor of Wyeth's in Maine, and she was disabled. Now, she could have used a wheelchair, but apparently her preference was to just crawl or drag herself around wherever she needed to go. And it makes me wonder just who is disabled. There's a legal definition of disability that's used by the Social Security Administration. It's the inability to perform substantial gainful work due to a medically determinable physical or mental impairment that has lasted or is expected to last at least 12 months or will likely cause death. That's the definition for adults. In New Jersey, minors may be entitled to disability benefits such as Medicaid, which is New Jersey Family Care, and Social Security income if they have a developmental disability, or the child has a medically determinable physical or mental impairment which results in marked and severe functional limitations, and the impairment has lasted or can be expected to last for a continuous period of at least 12 months or result in death. I took Sonja with me down to the Social Security office in Trenton because I wanted the woman behind the desk to see that my daughter was in fact disabled. Because sometimes it's hard to prove to the folks who have to make these determinations that a child is actually disabled. It was pretty evident that she was. But a person who can successfully maneuver in her own environment might not be disabled, at least in her own mind. And I thought of all kinds of examples. I thought of conjoined twins. There's some famous conjoined twins. If you've ever heard of Abby and Brittany Hensel, so these young women are conjoined from about here up, from here down. So they share from about the waist down, but they have 2 spines, 2 hearts, 2 stomachs, 2 heads, and 2 personalities. And they're remarkable. They are school teachers. They went to college. They're married, so there you are. Would they be disabled? I don't think they think of themselves as disabled. Or look at the deaf community. Deaf individuals who identify with deaf culture, which has its own language, values, its traditions, its norms, particular identity. They don't think of themselves as disabled within their community. People with Down syndrome and other sorts of intellectual differences know they are differently abled. They know it. I don't know why this culture is so afraid of children with Down syndrome that we find reasons to eliminate them. I don't understand that at all, because the kids I've known with Downs are delightful and mostly able to be somewhat independent, structured environment, but pretty independent. They don't necessarily think of themselves as disabled. A person who uses a wheelchair successfully as an extension of herself might not consider herself disabled when navigating her community, provided there are ramps, curb cuts, lifts, and adequate transportation, because she's able to do all the things necessary for her well-being, for employment, and living independently. And what might be disabling in one context is not in another. A good deal of what we think of as disabling is disabling because of context. And in some ways, I think disability is a social construct. Father George knows more about patristics. I know nothing about patristics, but this is a quote attributed to Irenaeus. And you see this all the time, usually in memes with like some guy running down a beach or someone climbing a mountain. It's all very ableist. It's all about living your fullest life, right? I don't actually think that's what Irenaeus was saying at all. And I think perhaps the glory of God, it's usually as a man fully alive, might have referred to Christ, but this actually is what the culture thinks. We have a fear of difference, and we are striving for perfection. And disability makes us uncomfortable. We want to be self-actualized. That's one of those words from the 70s. It's another way we want to be self-fulfilled. But we generally don't believe that disabled people are able to do that. They're not fully self-fulfilled individuals. They're not really human because they're needy. They may need help with mobility, learning, nutrition. They may need a supported workplace or a living environment. They may need some financial assistance, housing assistance, and specialized medical care. And like it or not, neediness is often seen as shameful. And we don't want to see these people because they are shocking or disturbing, and they remind us of our own limitations. And if you think that's not the case, this is one of the ugly laws which existed in various parts of the country, and this one was not repealed until 1974. Any person who is diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed so as to be an unsightly or disgusting object or an improper person to be allowed in or on the streets, highways, thoroughfares, or public places in the city shall not therein or thereon expose himself or herself to public view under the penalty of a fine of $1 for each offense. Now, of course, there were still disabled people on public view because plenty of disabled people were in the sideshows of circuses and other traveling events, which were pretty common in the 19th century, right into the 20th century. In fact, in the 70s, in Vermont, not far from where I went to college, there was an annual fair with a sideshow of people who were variously looked different, had different abilities, and they were called freaks. I just think this speaks for itself, and it speaks for our discomfort. One of the things, when I was working in the group home as the student chaplain, there was a house I went to that had really profoundly disabled people, people we never see in public. I mean, you never see these people in public. So there was a man there who was probably in his late 30s. He was nonverbal. He could say a few things. Obviously, he wore a diaper. He was somewhat physically challenged. They had to keep him from drinking water all day because that's the thing he wanted to do all day was drink water and play with toys. His father, I was told, and I actually met the father, would come about once a month and take this son aside in another room, and he would spend like a half hour trying to exorcise him. This man, who called himself a Christian, who gave me his little business card that says, "Jesus loves you," and it had a smiley face on it, would come with his wife, who would sit in the car, and he would take this young man aside, and when he was done with him, his son was so terrified and so afraid that the group home had to say eventually, "We cannot let you come anymore because you disrupt this fellow's day and you terrify him." Here was a father who, for whatever reason, believed that he individually was cursed because his son was cursed in some way, and he was going to exorcise the demons out of him. And so, we don't see these people, but they're there. They're there in our group homes and being cared for, better for worse. And honestly, they deserve all the care, the affection, the love, and respect that you would give to anybody. So this is always an issue. And it's the big question, why does God allow disability? You recognize this quote. Just let me point out in this picture, which is a great picture, by a contemporary Russian artist. There's the blind man, but look at the pattern in his attire, his robe. What are those? Little windows. Isn't that interesting? And above him, you can barely make out, is a hand, as if blessing, perhaps, and then there's a pair of eyes in the upper right-hand corner. I just think it's a fascinating picture. So why does God allow disability? Well, here are the answers you'll find online. It's the result of original sin when evil came into the world. Well, I think that makes disability inherently evil, and it's not. It's to reveal God's glory by curing disability so people will believe. Jesus cures a paralytic, a demon-possessed man, a man born blind, the woman with a hemorrhage, Jairus' daughter, Lazarus, etc. In the Old Testament, Elijah raises the son of the widow of Zarephath. So the only reason for disability is so that God can work a miracle. Another, God chooses the weak, despised, and lowly to shame the wise. And I remember this always sticks with me, from Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Tiny Tim is brought home from church on Christmas Day. Tiny Tim hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. Well, I think God does choose the weak and the despised and the lowly to shame the wise, but I don't think disability exists for that purpose alone. And finally, to make us trust God and recognize our dependence on God and not ourselves. All human ability and disability is part of God's plan, and that God will help his obedient servants. Paul's thorn in the flesh. You remember Paul talks about having, we don't know what it was. Maybe he was depressed. Some people say it's because he was bald. It's just, but Paul describes in the second letter to the Corinthians having a thorn in his flesh. I don't think any of us can say that God causes disability in the usual sort of cause and effect way of thinking about things in our material world. When we get to the end of this, and please someone keep me on time because I could talk forever about this, I'll tell you how I came to terms with it. I moved some things around. Okay. So here's another neat picture. This is Norman Rockwell. Lift up thine eyes. And I think it's St. Thomas Church in Manhattan. And obviously, the point of the picture was we've got all these people on the sidewalk busily heading wherever they need to go. There's the priest. He's got the sexton on a ladder. The doves are flying up. But what do we notice here? What do we got? I was glad when they said unto me, let us go to the house of the Lord, if you can get in. Now, I took Sonja with me because we were going to watch a friend be ordained, and we wanted to trip into the city, and she was using a walker at the time. This is the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. So we're standing here, and I'm looking at all those stairs. And we get across the street, and I park her in her walker, with one with a seat. And I'm looking around for the disability entrance, the access to this church. And I run up the steps, and I ask someone at the door. He says, oh, well, you have to go back around, and you have to come around here, and behind the hurricane fence and this construction area, to the back of the church where the dumpsters are, and where there's a lift that brings, when they bring animals into the church and things like that, which they do at St. John the Divine. And you have to ring a buzzer. And so I rang the buzzer out there in the back where the trash is and waited for the lift to be lowered so that we could get into the church with the walker. This is the General Theological Seminary in Lower Manhattan. How do you think you get in there if you use a walker or a wheelchair? You can't attend class there either because all the buildings have stairs. There is an entrance on one side which actually has an apartment building, and you can go through the apartment building lobby, and then you'll find a ramp. But if you just show up at the seminary, you can't get in. There was a lift on the opposite side, but it was broken. All the years that I was going up to Manhattan to go to school, that lift was never repaired. This is our own diocese. You cannot get into diocesan house. So if you're disabled and you're working for the diocese, and you need to be in diocesan house, you can't get in.
Yeah,
and if
you have to be a flower deliverer to know how to get there.
Pardon me?
You have to be a flower deliverer to know how to get there.
Well, the cathedral is accessible, but diocesan house is not. And then finally, that could be any restroom, but it looks like the one in the cathedral. I don't think it is, but it looks rather like it. And the problem with restrooms, and we have this problem here too, at least in the restroom in the hallways, they're not accessible. And it's not a matter of just having enough turnaround space for someone with a wheelchair to use the toilet. It's they can't open the door. And frankly, they can't open the door into the sanctuary either, even though the sanctuary is accessible. There's no way to open the door to the church. If you, let's say you drove yourself in your handicap car with the levers and everything. I had a member of my old congregation whose husband was blind. He'd been blind since he was 3 years old. And she used a wheelchair, and she drove the family around in the van, and they would come to St. Luke's. They could get up the ramp, but somebody would have to open the door. This is what we never think about. We able-bodied people, we never think about that. Anyway, that's my pet peeve. As someone who had to push a walker, help Sonja push a walker, and then it had a seat so I could push her like she was in a chair, and then a wheelchair, and then a bigger wheelchair, it was impossible to go to a lot of places. It was impossible for her to go to music therapy without a great deal of effort. It was impossible to go to a coffee shop in Princeton because every place has steps up and steps down. But like it or not, we worship a disabled God. I know a lot of us like to picture Jesus as some kind of fair-skinned, auburn-haired, hazel-eyed, handsome young man, somebody in the prime of life. I guess we imagine him handsome according to Western European standards because we know he was very attractive to people were attracted to him. And so because we're put off by disabled people, we have to imagine Jesus as being really a good-looking guy. But there is a story out there I came across years ago that Jesus himself was disabled. He was short, he was ugly, he was sort of twisted. And that explains why Zacchaeus had to climb a tree. It was not because Zacchaeus was short, it was because Jesus was short, and he had to climb a tree to see Jesus coming. And the reason why Jesus died so quickly on the cross, because most people lingered for days in a crucifixion, and Jesus, we're told, died in a matter of hours, that he was already physically disabled, and that he was compelling because of his disability, so that the poor and the sick and others who were at the margins of society identified with him because he was one of them. He also was on the margins of society. And that's an interesting way to think about Jesus. You know, there's nothing at all about Jesus' appearance in the Gospels. Sometimes we look to Isaiah and the suffering servant as someone he had no form or comeliness that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and is one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. And this is what Nancy Iceland, who wrote The Disabled God, had in mind. She had this in mind, that Jesus appeared to his disciples with his wounds, and Thomas, of course, was the one who wasn't there when Jesus first appeared and said, I'm not going to believe until I can put my finger into the holes in his hands, till I can put my hand into his side. This is a famous painting by Caravaggio. And there's a disabled body resurrected. But this is a modern one. This is a version where that opening is a scar now, and we have these sort of hipster-looking guys looking at Jesus, who's, you know, kind of a handsome, buff dude, but there he is. He's got scars still. So there have been people who have wondered, well, if we believe in the resurrection of the body, as we say in our creeds, what kind of body are we thinking of? I was at a memorial service for Sonja. It was held by someone in her father's church. And a woman came up to me afterwards, and she was trying to be comforting, I know. And she said to me, when Sonja is in heaven, she will have a perfect body. She will have a perfect body. She won't have any troubles anymore. She won't be in any pain anymore. And I was like, yeah, I don't think so. That's not at least how I think it's meant to be. So this is a small painting by Mako. Sonja and I went out to Mako's studio years ago, and he showed us how he does his work, which is fascinating, and how he grinds the pigments, the stone, and also mixes it with animal glues. And I don't know if he's described that for you, but his work is fascinating. And he made this little thing for Sonja. And I have it here because to me, it has always spoken of two things. For one thing, this gold leaf is very fragile and it tends to flake off. And in some ways, that's just, things sort of fall apart over time, don't they? Material things just do. But on the other hand, it's a leaf. It's a leaf, and there's this wonderful passage from Revelation. The leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. Nothing accursed will be found there anymore. Some people read this as individual healing as well. And the word accursed here, in the Greek, it really means something more like set aside for destruction. Something or someone doomed for destruction. So people who are disabled think of their disability, especially if they've lived with it for a long time, as being integral to who they are. Why would you necessarily want to give up who you are in the new creation? I had to think about and come to terms with why Sonja was disabled and how we deal with it. I remember talking with Diogenes Allen about this. Some of you remember Diogenes. And saying the only way I can figure this out is to just think that God's capacity and creative energy, God's capacity to make and create things and the energy involved is so vast and so beyond our understanding that even, genetic defects are just out there as part of God's good creation. It's troubling to the people who have to care for them, for people with these deformities, these defects, these differences. But it's not different, is it, from, let's say, a flower or a fruit that because of some encounter with the environment or just some fluke of genetic change, of cell division and the copying of chromosomes, comes out with some kind of unexpected different appearance. Sometimes when that happens, we say, oh, that's a beautiful new flower. Let's see if we can reproduce it. Or that's a delicious new kind of apple. Let's see if we can reproduce that. And sometimes it appears as something that we don't want to keep, that we're not interested in. And it might be useless to us. And when it comes to individuals, it might be painful for us. But that's just part of creation. And I don't know how else to make that work. That was how I came to terms with Sonja's disability. She was a perfect child of God. She was absolutely perfect. She was complete. We think of perfection as being complete. She was who she was. And in the new creation, which none of us knows, we can all imagine, but none of us knows, she will still be herself. She will be herself with all her genetic differences, hopefully with no pain, right? Right. And the same is true of her best friend with Down syndrome. She will be just herself, her delightful self. And the same is true of the kid in her class who was sort of a boyfriend, who had Marfan's and other disabilities. And not only did he look somewhat peculiar, but he had issues. And so will be the children that are, we would call dysmorphic because their heads are too small, or some other part of them is not right, or they never learn to speak, or they can't read, or they can't walk. And then we have to think about what about people who are injured in this life? What will they be like? You think of veterans of war, you think of people who are injured in accidents, all kinds of things. And who will they be in the new creation? And I don't know. But I think for those people who were born with genetic differences, those differences are who they are. They are fundamentally who they are. And it can't be any other way. Anyway, I'm not a theologian, and that's about as much as I can tell you. But anyway, I don't know if we have time for a few questions. Do we have time?
I think so. Yeah, we have a few minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot. Yeah. 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 So as I say, I did a lot of praying. And I attended a seminary up in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And it was a seminary that was that welcomed all kinds of folks from all kinds of backgrounds, including people who are part of a tradition that believes in the power of prayer to actually heal and to make, and I mean heal, physically heal, like change someone with a disability, or someone who's a paralytic will get up and walk. That's just core to who they are. And so I was praying like them for a while, and then I said, that's ridiculous. That's not going to work. And so I began to think about my own troubles. Like, how am I going to get through this? How am I going to care for a child who can't do anything for herself? And in the end, she couldn't even talk. She could make noise. She could make noises, but she couldn't speak. Who's lost all of her abilities. Who basically has Parkinson's in a teenager, because that's how the disease progresses. It looks like Parkinson's in children. And I just had to trust that there was a way through it for myself and for her. And that's why I began to read, and I just began to think, and you can read scripture at a very surface level, especially when you're reading it in a translation. And you're not thinking deeply about what's really going on. That so often when we read about Jesus' cures, what seems to be the most important thing is that Jesus is restoring people to a community in which they are going to be once again welcomed because they could not participate in their community with their particular disease or disability, and that it was the welcoming into community and the restoration to community that was the most important part of these healing miracles. And I had to think about that. That maybe really what's important is that Sonja remains in community, and I remain in community. Among my clients, I've had older adults. So you have a couple who are in their 80s and they have a disabled child living at home, and that disabled child is, 50-something years old, and they've never done anything to get the child out into the community, given it some independence, give a chance to live in a structured setting or to work in a kind of a supported workplace. And because there's a lot of shame involved. I would go places with Sonja's friends and their parents, and the kids make noise and they act up, and they're just themselves in a lot of ways. And there was almost always a parent, and it was typically a father, who was totally embarrassed, completely embarrassed. Stop doing that. Sit down. Be quiet. Because it's shame. This is my child and I can't control it. Look what happened. Look what I made. I'm ashamed. There's a lot of that. Okay, so I wandered off from your question. But I don't know. I just had to come to terms with it. Yes?
Thank you very much for sharing this. You probably know we have a 48-year-old
I know.
Down syndrome son.
Yeah.
And so I could empathize with a lot of what you're saying. But he is, well, first of all, we found out within like 24 hours versus a number of years.
Mm-hmm.
So we've been very, very fortunate. He became actually the center of our family and has just a fantastic relationship with his three siblings. But he's really lucky to be living in a community which is based on the teachings of Rudolf Steiner. And
Mm-hmm.
the fundamental belief there is that every individual, regardless of any outward challenges, physically, mentally, the soul is intact. So they really see the soul and they see the person, and that's how they treat everyone within the community with tremendous respect. And the caregivers actually live in the community and in the houses together, and sometimes it's hard to tell the difference.
Yeah, and that's sort of like,
can't feel community.
Okay. That's sort of like L'Arche, the same idea. Yeah. Yeah.
He's just extremely fortunate, and we are too, and he has and it's a working farm. He has an incredible quality of life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we take him everywhere too. So and I've always been very impressed, whether it's on New York City subways or out in Princeton or anywhere. People are very friendly and accepting, and you will even in church here too, which is one of the things that attracted us to
Mm-hmm.
church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's true. And I generally found that was the case moving around with Sonja as well. That although I did get a little tired of the sort of, oh, God bless you, taking care of this.
What I enjoy is that if you're at the airport, people like you go to the front of the line.
Oh, well, that's true too. We get on the plane first. Unfortunately, we're always the last ones off the plane too. So that is true. That is true.
Megan?
Yes.
I just wanted to, I have feelings right now that Janet and Sonja are together, because Janet used to always, when it would come to the early service,
Yes.
she'd be there.
Yes.
She'd be always concerned
Yeah.
about Sonja.
Yeah.
I just see the two of them.
Yeah. Sonja loved church. Sonja really loved the experience of church. She loved Trinity Cathedral. When I was there as a deacon for a short time, I would sit in the choir and she would sit next to me. And she would always have tears running down her face. And people would be so concerned about her. I said, no, she's just like Marjorie a Kempis. She's the crying saint, It just, she's just impressed. And she would be staring up at the windows and, yeah. She was so pleased whenever she could be given some little task to do while she was still able. Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for letting me share a story.